Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Sustainable Work. I have an amazing Dee O'Neill here with me today. So exciting. Welcome, Dee.
Thank you, Maria. I'm just thrilled to be here.
Yes. So, a little bit about Dee. She's a keynote speaker, author, and founder of NeuroCognitive Fitness, a boutique concierge brain fitness assessment and training practice, helping clients more deeply understand how their brain works and how to make it work better. During more than 17 years in brain research and clinical work, it became evident to Dee that there was a gap in translating complex neuroscience findings into real life application. Her personal and professional purpose is to practice and promote health, hope, and joy through optimizing brain fitness and performance. Dee is a self-described neuroscience nerd. She's had the distinct pleasure of helping clients and leadership teams create and sustain fulfilling and high performance roles, workplaces, and lives by educating, enhancing, and empowering. Dee harnesses her very unique experience and expertise into highly engaging interactive events, translating brain science principles into practical practices that transform our brains, behavior, and bottom line. This is so cool, Dee. I'm really so excited to speak to you. And I said that a couple of weeks when we first spoke is that in my undergraduate studies, I was in a social cognitive neuroscience lab and then went off to organizational psychology. So I'm just so excited to speak to you, to like the person who understands the neuroscience and who can tell us what does research say, what strategies can we use to optimize our brain. So welcome, and yes, please tell us about you, what you do, what your work is about. Who are you?
Okay, awesome. Well, that was a great introduction. I forgot the neuroscience nerd piece in there, so that's just my self-disclosure. But I think sometimes that that kind of brings in my tribe of other people who are also kind of obsessed with this combination of what we know from brain science, but really more importantly, translating that into real practical and relevant ways that we can optimize our personal and professional lives. And I really got kind of obsessed with it in graduate school. I have a master's in counseling psychology, so I thought I would go into psychology counseling. And once I took a neuropsychology course, I just got obsessed with this brain behavior relationship. Why do we do what we do?
Mhm.
And on my long walk this morning, I started thinking to myself that, especially in today's COVID world and all the stress that we have with burnout and workplaces struggling with what is work going to look like, what is a healthy, sustainable workplace, but also I think a sustainable person. What does that look like going forward? Because I think it's going to be different than what we've known before. So I think the brain science is going to be key to help us build what that can look like at its best. Um, and the thought that came to me this morning was breaking the brain pain cycle. So a lot of the work that I focus on is not so much clinical or diagnostic of what's wrong with our brains, but really what's positive and what can we just enhance and empower more to really harness all of those aspects.
That's so interesting. So could you speak a little bit more about that? Because I think it's so relevant to our discussion in this summit, but generally about work. And, the last year, 2020, also going into this year with the pandemic, a lot of other global events that happened, there is a lot of pain. There is a lot of trauma and suffering. So uh, what do we do? What does research say about that? And
Right.
how can we enhance our lives now?
It's interesting. About a year before, in 2019, I did a TEDx talk about harnessing stress to optimize our brain health. And so even then, burnout was an issue, stress was I mean, all these things aren't new. They're just really, I think, highlighted and compounded right now, and almost like imminent to that it has to be addressed very quickly. And so really, I think that what can we do is as individuals, but also as corporations, is to recognize that there is going to be an impact from our mental health standpoint. And so I think addressing that recognizing that stress is happening. It's affecting our sleep. It's affecting how people show up at work, our performance level, and how can we, as the code word pivot, how can we pivot the way our expectations around work or deliverables and things like that, so that we meet people where they are in this current time. Because we know that whole topic of the TEDx talk was stress is not a bad thing, but how can we really use that same physiological arousal and activation to enhance our performance, to be more alert and more focused, rather than letting it sort of drain our energy. There's so much that we can tap into the research around physiological neuroscience to really highlight those ideas.
Okay, yes, this is so interesting to me. I know we're going to talk about a slightly different topic later on in the interview, but could you maybe give a couple of strategies that relate to that, what you just said, that using your physiological activation to harness the energy of stress towards the positive versus towards the negative?
Yeah, absolutely. And please Google the TEDx talk, because that actually does have, that wraps up with 3 key strategies. One is the idea of reframing. What I really pride myself in doing, but sometimes feel bad about doing, is I try to translate really complex neuroscience into really tactical and practical information. Sometimes the academic sort of scientist in me feels like I'm, watering down too much. But what I found over so many years of working with executive leadership teams and with corporate groups is the only way it really sticks, or it really is practical, is if we really break it down. Mention the neuroscience without getting too nerdy about it, but really, so, because people will often leave with like, so now how do I use this? What do I do with it? And so the idea of reframing any situation sounds simplistic, but it actually does change our brain and our physiology. So say and I'll often give the example of like a roller coaster ride, right? You might have 2 people going on a roller coaster ride. It's the same event, and one person's, got their arms up, screaming, enjoying it, and the other person's really terrified. So our perspective and the way that we're interpreting any situation is going to impact how we feel in it. And so just to help our own brains and to help our long-term mental health, it can be helpful to just reframe the situation. Maybe from I'm stressed or I'm worried to I'm challenged or I'm curious. It's sort of interesting when we do that. It really does shift sort of how it's feeling viscerally. And then the other one from that talk was recalibrating. It's so important that we, I think, be proactive and preventive in all of these things. And then I also have a whole separate brain basics model, where the basics is an acronym for some really simplistic things, like the B is for breathing. When we're stressed and anxious, if I'd ask everyone to think about a time in their life when they've been really stressed, what do we notice happens in our body, right? Our breathing gets really shallow, our heart rate increases, our stomach might hurt, we're sweating, maybe shaky. And that happens whether the event is really unpleasant or really pleasant. So it's just our body sort of adapting to whatever is happening to us that's either new or unknown or outside of our comfort zone. And so one way that we can lower that sort of activation, if it's unpleasant, is to just focus on our breathing. And I think mindful breathing right now is such a hot topic. And the idea of heart rate variability is really important. Our heart and brains are very connected to the vagus nerve. And so as simple as practices like the Navy SEALs use, box breathing, where you're just inhaling for 4 or 5 seconds, maybe holding and then exhaling for 4 or 5 seconds. But what I have found in the research and even practically, the way we activate or turn on the vagus nerve is by extending that exhale. And we can literally feel our heart rhythm changing when we have a longer or at least equal exhale as opposed to our inhale. And so breathing to me is just the key to everything. And we all have access to it. It's free. It's always with us. And I think just noticing throughout the day, if you're feeling stressed or tired, focus into breathing. Maybe I'm in shallow breathing mode.
Mhm.
And the A, very simply, is affirmations. That's kind of that reframing. How can we focus more on having positive, reaffirming emotions and thinking? The other last ones get really into the fundamental lifestyle factors like sleep. It is so important that we're getting 8 hours of sleep a night. I love to ask a big group, who's getting 8? Few hands go up. Most high performance executives and business leaders today are, getting 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. And maybe they can operate with that, but we know it takes a toll on our brain health. We want to get so much REM sleep to help clean out toxins and really give us that regenerative sleep.
Yeah, and then to optimize performance too, right? If you're getting 45 hours of sleep, you are not coming to work as your best self. You are not bringing me as an employee or a leader, whomever. You're just not showing up. You're not giving me the best you can, or giving yourself the best you can. And I just
Yeah.
like those, I love all the strategies you shared. As like a long time yogi and meditator, breathing is a big part of my practice. And God, does that help, just standing up, in the middle of my workday and taking 5 long breaths changes everything. And it's interesting you mentioned reframing. I think that's what I did that this morning. I'm a new entrepreneur. I left my corporate job a couple of months ago, and there's this whole thing, new realm of new things I need to do. Like I need to learn, right? Like business strategy, marketing, like none of the things that I even thought of before. And it was a little bit daunting until this morning. I was speaking to someone and it dawned on me, like, I love school. This is like school all over again. So, and I was
Yeah.
like, yes, I get to learn all of these things. So yes, totally. I love that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I think I'm the same way. I'm always like, should I go back to school and get a PhD? Because I'm also a lifelong learner. I love to be having new information coming. And I think that's part of, I'll often show this slide of our cognitive abilities, our wisdom. Some things get better with age and over time, but most of our cognitive skills like memory, attention, processing decline. And there's sort of this drastic decline around age 40. Like when most executives start to think they're at their peak, their brain is actually starting to slow down a little bit. But I love to point out, though, that study, which was a really big, well-validated study, was done about 10 or so years ago. So what we've learned so much in the last decade around brain science, that we can build new brain cells, we can strengthen connections, and a lot of it is around new learning. And now we have so many new people have, I think, an average of 6 jobs, whereas generations before you had one job for like most of your life. So that learning just wasn't happening. That ability or need to build new brain cells wasn't there. So I'm the same way. We're both learning nerds, I guess.
Yes. Well, that's awesome. Okay, so I want to ask you to move on to the next topic that we're going to discuss and ask you first, how do you define sustainable work?
I love this concept, and I think it's probably going to be fluid for me. And I can't wait to watch all the other speakers to see kind of how it's been defined before. But again, looking through my lens of brain health, I think a sustainable workplace is one that recognizes that the humans that come to work every day is what's going to make it sustainable. And a sustainable uh, employee base is what's going to help maintain and have the endurance for that corporation over time. I always like to say our well-being is based on our well-brain. And so I think it's sustainable when the workplace is recognizing what are the things that need to be offered or available to each employee so that they can show up every day at their best.
Mhm. And I mean, I'm sure there's like plenty of things that can be offered, but I guess I don't know if there are general things that you can speak to that organization can look at or offer to the employees or take into consideration when they think about the sustainable work concept, or maybe talk about if they're all different, how would you guide the organization through finding what they are for them?
Yeah, what I found after many years of working with corporations um, is it's so different. It varies so much based on the organization and the industry and the leadership. The most forward thinking, and I think really successful companies I was able to work with recognize that the employee health and well-being was number one. Everything else would follow. All the results and the ROI come from your people performing at their best. And I've definitely read the articles of some companies like I think Google or Amazon, building in these amazing campuses where people can have nap pods or have ping pong. And so they're really trying to provide things that they believe really help enhance well-being and sustainability. I think that if a workplace is open to recognizing more of a flexible workplace, I just got off a webinar with the Neuro Leadership Institute and how this hybrid of work is probably what's down the pike, right? That many workplaces may not go back to all in office. And so how do we support employees to be more autonomous through, I think, just the right amount of accountability, whether it's just about, I love the idea of this ROI about results, outcome with impact, that it really matters more of what what each person is accomplishing daily, weekly, as opposed to just the sort of butts in seats mentality or hourly. The idea of this hourly work week maybe is less helpful to keep us operating at our best in this current environment. Absolutely. So that's one very simple one, but I mean, I'm just always so encouraged when I see things. I've been seeing chief learning officer being a really top new title. And so I think encouraging learning in the workplace, that is going to be, I think, how we build more sustainable companies and certainly more successful companies. Chief happiness officer. These are like real titles people get to have. I mean, I just feel like if that's your title, you have to show up every day, like pretty happy and like encouraging. So I see a lot of it happening, and I think there's so much that we'll be able to see what works in all these different organizations.
Yes, great. Thank you for saying that. And definitely, I think one of the themes that's emerging through all of these interviews that I'm conducting for the summit is that placing employee health and well-being and making it the strategy of your company that's then going to bring the ROI with it is really important. Yes. Okay. So one thing that is your specialty and one of your talk topics is wired for wonder. It sounds so beautiful. Can you talk about that, please?
I just love to hear it myself. It came from, for a while, I was doing some research in the brain science of awe in the brain. What happens to our brain and our body when we have these awe experiences? And when we think about what are our awe experiences, they tend to fall into kind of three different buckets, whether it's aesthetic. People often say, oh, I went to the Grand Canyon, it was awe-inspiring. Or they might say the birth of my first child. And that's more like an adoration bucket, I call it. So it's around people that we love, or that sort of heartfelt connection to something that feels really big. And I think that what we found through studying awe is I wondered, well, how do we, and the brain science showed that when we have these awe experiences, our brains change. And one study that was done from Dr. Bo Lotto out of the lab of Misfits, he found that following people over time, after people had these kind of extreme awe experiences, they felt they were more collaborative, they were more generous, they felt more connected to other human beings. And so there's power. And I thought, well, that's how can we harness this to do more of it? And I came up with the idea that, the way to have more awe, because awe is really the final experience, but it's this mindset of wonder or curiosity that allows us to have more awe experiences. Mm-hmm. And so the whole talk that I go through, it's my favorite keynote right now, because I get to have people thinking about a topic they haven't really thought about before, and then leaving with really practical tools to and ways or ideas to have more awe in their life to make their brain healthier.
That's amazing. I love it. It makes me think also one of the interviews that I had here, we were talking more about like spiritual perspective to developing like business, and we talked about wonder. And
Mm.
so one of the things that we talked about there, when I go on vacation, I never plan anything. I go on vacation and I just wake up, or like, plan for tomorrow morning, and like what I want to do, what feels like really good to me today, and I go and do it. And my vacations are the best, that I just in that state of wonder and curiosity, and just like, wow, everything is so beautiful. And then I come back to work, and there's like spots of wonder and curiosity here and there, but I lose the state. I'm not living in it. So it would be interesting to learn from you, what are the strategies? How do you harness? How do you bring yourself in that state of awe and wonder? Because I mean, not only does it feel good, but according to you, it also produces amazing results in terms of how and what people can perform.
Yeah. And again, in my goal to translate stuff that can be quite complex, I distilled it down to three kind of simplistic strategies. And so the first one is mindset. And so the idea, it kind of ties back to the reframing strategy that I was working on in my stress research. But mindset of just, what emotion are we feeling most of the time? Are we kind of focusing on what's not working or what's not going right? Or are we able to sort of be more patient with ourselves and with other people to try to have the most, I hate to say positive, like it's kind of airy-fairy, but that just the most regenerative, which the Heart Math Institute that teaches a lot of heart rate variability training, they talk about regenerative emotions. How often are we having emotions that make us feel better as opposed to feeling worse? So that mindset's really important. Being mindful, I think, is almost the easiest and number one strategy. As you mentioned, like just not being in the moment to even notice what's going on around us. I know you were in Hawaii recently, and I lived in Hawaii for many years. So the example I'll give in my keynote is my commute for many years was over Diamond Head. I would drive from Honolulu over to more like the Kahala town, that side, and it's literally around Diamond Head. And I have some pictures of that vista. And I had this epiphany many years ago when I still lived there before I was even in this line of work. And I would occasionally I'd look over away from my sort of blinders driving down the road, and I would notice this amazing vista out into the ocean and be like, wow, holy cow, like I live in a beautiful place. But I didn't do that every day, or I didn't do that very often. And now I wish I had, or had just sort of appreciated it in the moment. But I think we're so busy, we're all doing so much. As a counselor, there's a saying that anxiety is when we're worried about the future, things that we can't control that maybe we think are going to happen or upcoming. And depression is more when we're stuck in the past, still thinking about something that maybe we didn't like, or that we weren't happy about. But being in the moment is really so key for mental health. And that's what can keep us away from both anxiety and depression, is just in the moment, staying really present. And the third and final one, where I love that you mentioned it too, that we get stuck in status quo, right? Our brains are habit machines. We want to and our brains don't want to work that hard. So when we are doing new things, sometimes it takes that extra energy and effort. So the third one I call mindscape, but it just really is the idea of changing the landscape of what we pay attention to, being more curious, just kind of being open to the possibilities that all experiences are available to us, maybe all the time. And so I encourage and I consult and coach around having everyday awe. How can we kind of stop, be more mindful, be more positive, to notice those times when it's like, oh, wow, look at that. Oh, something that kind of stops you and inspires you or makes you curious. So those are the three kind of most simple ones. And I know some of the content that we're sharing, there's a whole ebook that you can read that has all this outlaid, and some metrics, because I'll ask people, well, how much awe do you have in your life, or how much awe do you have? And there are actually metrics now. Several researchers have metrics where you can measure how much awe you're having in your life, and that gives you ideas of how to have more by addressing what those questions are.
Mhm. Yeah, I love it. One thing that comes to mind for me is that it's kind of like on an individual level, taking responsibility for your own experience, right? Because you're right. Our brains are these machines that want to save energy and don't want to work so hard. So it's taking that power back, that responsibility back, that I don't have to live in a state of stress, right? I actually have the power if I make a decision and if I take the time to bring myself back to the center, to the present moment, to the mindful living. Because the strategy sounds simple, right? Just be mindful of the moment. It's not that simple to do. So
Yeah.
yeah. Mhm.
It's not that simple to do, and also everything's working against it, sort of. It's a conspiracy, um, because our brain is wired. I love to sort of. I've gotten a lot of clarity for myself recently of like, what's my key message that I want people to leave any talk I give, and ultimately it is that we do have that power, at least to change our own experience of something from a mental or emotional and physiological standpoint. We can't always control what happens, the event, but we can kind of more so control how we respond to it. And I think that that's sort of that idea that it is our responsibility at that level to keep as in control of that as possible, because the brain, as I said earlier, it's really wired to just be sort of a survival mechanism, right? So our brain is keeping us alive, so it's always looking for threats. The amygdala, that emotional fight or flight part of our brain, its job is to just look for what could kill us, right? Um, Evolutionary, it's what kept us alive on the savannah. There's great research by Robert Sapolsky. He has some great videos out there where they watch animals out in the wild and measure their cortisol, their stress levels as they fight predators or look for food, that kind of thing. And in the same way, today we're kind of looking for threats. So when someone cuts us off in traffic, we get angry and get mad about it. And that there's that same sort of cortisol stress response in our body, kind of tearing away at our health, when really we could decide to not get that upset about it.
Yeah.
So I think it does sound so simplistic, but not only is it accessible, I almost feel like it's imperative, because we're seeing such a increase in burnout and anxiety that if we don't address it, I think the mental health crisis will be quite severe.
Absolutely. One thing for me that came to mind right now, I was reading a book last night, and so the woman who wrote it, she is like a longtime Buddhist meditator, and the one thing she said there, the mind is crazy. And that kind of stuck with me. I went to bed last night, I was like, yeah, the mind is crazy. So, and just like knowing that for me, like the mind is crazy. So waking up in the morning, what am I going to do to make it less crazy?
Yeah, I love that idea. I've seen the analogy and pictures of picturing your brain as like a rabid dog on a leash, tied up to a pole, and it's out there barking at everything, running around, trying to get off the leash and crazy. But then if we can train our brain, like to train the dog to calm down, where it isn't so erratic and like frenetic energy. I'll often say that state of anxiety and stress, and again, looking for what's wrong, is the human condition. When I have clients coming to me and saying, oh, I don't know why I'm so stressed, I don't know why I can't sleep. Um, and I think it's because we just aren't given or taught that it takes work. Like a healthy brain isn't a given. Kind of like, I mean, I just turned 51 this year, and I feel like, wow, physically, it's not as easy as it used to be. And there's so many more things that I had to do to stay on top of it. And it just isn't as accessible, that knowledge about our brain. And so what do we do to keep our brain fit and healthy, just like our physical energy and exercise, we know can be impacted by simple things like working out. I love to share the analogy of physical fitness. We focus on, right, strength, endurance, and flexibility. And the brain has those same kind of metrics. I do brain mapping, EEG, so it's a cap on the head. have a little example of it back there if you can kind of see it. And
Yes.
then and we measure the brain waves of the brain. And we can see if someone's brain is overactive, too much what we call high beta, they're going to be stressed and anxious. Maybe they have too much of slow wave activity, so they're more like on the depression side of the scale. So once we measure it, we can say, oh, here's why. Here's how your brain is currently wired. But there's so much that we can do, whether it is those lifestyle factors like exercise and sleep and nutrition. But I think so much of the cognitive piece is that's why we have such I think so much people going to therapy, going to counselors and coaches to look for that way to learn the information and to keep ourselves accountable. It's like a brain gym, right? We have to go and do all those things every day to stay on the healthier side of it.
So, I wonder if my understanding is that regardless of like how many years you're going to be doing all these practices, it's still a practice. Like you need to be doing these practices every day. Like the conditioning, the brain condition is not going to go away. But like, does it get easier, or like what's, I guess, over time, as we know that like learning and practice changes the brain. So what changes can people expect if they stick with the practice over time?
Yeah, that's such an important insight, because many times I'll have people say, well, I tried meditation once, it didn't work, right? That would be like saying, I went to the gym once, it didn't work. I took one aerobics class, it didn't work. Thinking about our brain in the same way as our body, that it takes regular, consistent, daily something to keep our brain healthy, like our body. And the reason it takes time is right because we're rewiring what's become sort of habitual in our brain. Our brain gets used to being in that anxiety mode, or it gets used to being in that slower mode. And so we're literally training the brain to release more neurochemicals, to fire at a higher level. So there are things that we can do to calm down an anxious brain, and there are things that we can do to speed up a brain that's maybe too slow. And that just takes time. Just like if you have a physical fitness goal, I want to run a marathon, or I just want to be more fit and healthy. We tend to like set a goal that's a couple months away, because we know it's going to take time, and we know it's going to take that regular cumulative effect to reach our goal. And I think that one way that it becomes rewarding and reinforcing is once we get past that, that traditional learning curve, right? When we start to do something that we're not used to doing, it's uncomfortable. Because again, the brain is having to do something different. But there's kind of that learning curve where then it becomes easier with more practice, and then it becomes that automatic, that unconscious competence at the end of that learning curve. But it takes enough reinforcement I guess repetition is the right word, repetition or reinforcement of that new habit for it to become more ingrained and more hardwired to overtake the kind of unhealthy brain patterns that have maybe been overly reinforced.
Yeah, so the way I'm understanding it, I'm going to use my own example. I have an anxious brain, so that type of wavelengths. And like the more I practice, let's say meditation or mindfulness in the morning, the less anxious my brain is going to be, and also the easier or less time will it take for me to get to the place of like peace and comfort, or less anxiousness over time. Correct? Is that right?
Yeah. What I'll often say, just even to kids when I have children clients, it's just lowering that threshold. We're never not going to have zero anxiety, and the goal isn't to have none in our life, because we actually do need some. Stress can be a good thing. The term eustress is stress that actually helps us perform better, helps us be at our best. But if each practice, every time you're practicing meditation or yoga, just think of that anxiety threshold lowering, so that we aren't as like easily triggered when something does happen, or for no reason. I have so many clients, there's something called generalized anxiety disorder. People who are just anxious all the time without really any specific reason. And so if we can use all the tools of being mindful, focusing on our breathing, that can sometimes change our state. And so I think it really is just That's why I call it practical practices, just little things that we can do every day, just like we have habits of like brushing our teeth and taking a shower, even just starting really small amounts of sitting and breathing for 1 minute, those 5-second inhale and exhale cycles while we're driving or while we're walking the dog, slowly building them in and then noticing how much better we feel. We tend to start doing it more.
Yeah, thank you. That makes me think about back to work and, optimizing performance and that state of awe and all of that, well, when I'm in the feeling of anxiety, that takes my attention and my focus away from actually doing the work and actually being present, right? So that's why I think all of these tools and actually practicing them is so important, that um, when we think about work, to have good and what's the word I'm looking for, like effective performance where I can do my best in the shortest amount of time, I need to be as focused as possible. So yes.
Yeah, and that makes me think when I'm working with especially executive leadership teams who are really, super smart and really successful and accomplished, and their goal is to really be even sharper and more successful. And I think what it really to be more innovative and creative, I think it really does take that that extra step to if someone's already doing all those basic things, then maybe there's a next level of doing some more innovative type of things, or how do we take it to the next level where it's expanding what we already know from a cognitive perspective, or being better at seeing perspectives. So there's always something that we can do to challenge our brain. Just like at the gym, we'd add more weights, or we would do something a little harder. It helps to have the same approach to brain health.
Okay, thank you. So I understand these are like individual practices that people can implement in their lives. So if you are working with an organization, right, and creating an environment where these types of practices or behaviors are supported, so kind of like providing opportunities, I guess, for employees to practice them, like what can organizations or teams do to promote that?
Gosh, I know a lot of organizations will either bring in speakers. I've been doing lots of now virtual team meetings. It all just starts with education and awareness. And many times people will, I often ask people, how often do you think about your brain? And I'll show like a scale of 1 to 5. 1 is I never really think about my brain, to 5 is I always think about my brain. And that's often insightful for the individuals, but also for the leadership that maybe that are bringing me in to talk about brain health. Because I'm always surprised when people say I never think about my brain, but I've literally had people come up and say, I have never thought about like what's inside my head before. And then there are people on the ones who say, I'm always thinking about my brain. Often that's from a place of like worry or fear. Maybe they're worried about their own memory or ability to focus and pay attention. Or maybe they have a family member, might have children with ADHD or autism or something neurological, or a family member with Alzheimer's or cognitive impairment. And so my goal is always to kind of have moving people more to the middle, where they're thinking about their brain because they know there are things they can do to impact it. Because our brains we're wiring our brains every day, whether we know it or not. So maybe if we can do more things that are wiring it for a healthy outcome, then all the better. And then moving people from that thinking about it all the time, from the worry or fear perspective, to more hope and optimism that things can be improved, and that there are things that we can do proactively. And so I think the corporations that are bringing in this information is most impactful. And then what I'm often told at the end of just an hour talk is like, okay, what else? What else can we do? Because then it really does take how do we use this information in the workplace. After I gave that Wired for Wonder talk for a specific group, all the leadership was on it too. So they kind of left with some ways to think about how do we now use this information as an executive leadership team, but how do we use it more importantly, maybe with our clients? These insights that how our brains are wired, how is someone else's brain wired? So I think it really does provide some individual insights, but it can help the corporation to really grow into how they work with their clients as well.
Mhm. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. And what's like the framework, the overall framework that I'm seeing, right? If the company understands, as you said, that employee well-being is what they need to focus on, and that becomes their strategy. And then, okay, so if that is my strategy, what can I do? And bringing people like you to first educate people. And I agree with you that everything starts with education, with just even understanding um, what is that we're talking about, what we can do that can bring really good results.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes, people it's just another meeting they have to go to. And I've had people say, oh, I really didn't want to be at this meeting, but I'm so glad I was,
Yeah.
because it was useful information. And, I've just never really gotten the feedback of like, well, that wasn't really interesting or helpful. Because I think most people, I'm immersed in brain science. Most people aren't necessarily. So there's usually some nugget where they're like, oh, that makes sense. And that helps myself, or it helps me with my family, or it helps me with my coworkers and to be a better leader.
Mm.
And then I think so I think that might be what really is impactful at that level. And then certainly there are things a corporation could do. I know a lot of companies are there might be like a team challenge of this ring I'm wearing is the Aura ring. It's actually it measures heart rate, so it gives a nice readiness score every morning. And so I've seen some companies have challenges where like maybe they give everybody like an Aura ring, or people can use their smartwatch or a Fitbit, but challenges to see who's getting like the most restorative sleep over a week or two, who's working out to a certain amount, right? Because people just like the sort of the extra challenge that builds some team collaboration and healthy competition. So things like that might be helpful. I've seen some companies, it's long been sort of in the wellness sector, weight challenges, and heart health has been things that were under the wellness category. So very physical health. And I think now some of the companies are starting to notice, how do we address the brain health part of it? There's a wonderful app that I've joined forces with a little bit called Joyages. And they have an app that is all about sort of changing that mental health. How do we have more joyful moments in the day? That's why the joy comes from. And so it will ping you throughout the day to kind of check in with your mood, provides lots of great content about, again, more positive psychology. How do we reframe things and recalibrate things in the moment throughout the day? And I think sometimes companies embrace Joyages as a perk for people to have that for education, but also like ongoing sustainable ways to keep the brain top of mind.
I love
Keep
it.
the brain top of mind.
I love it. Like the rewards, the one thing that comes to mind is rewards and recognition, right? So I know when there's a lot of talk about that on a lot of social media right now, is kind of around stop wearing your exhaustion as a badge of honor. But it's also, I guess, in the organizations on the group level, if what is rewarded and recognized, even implicitly, right, is how exhausted I am, or how I didn't sleep last night to get all this work done, and you get like a pat on the back for that, people will do more and more of that because they think that's what's expected. But if you have, like, I love that you said like sleep challenge, who's got the deepest sleep in the last 2 weeks. God, that's a challenge I want to participate in. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of fun because it has this whole readiness score, and then it shows how long were you in deep sleep, which is when your body, like your muscles, are relaxing. How long were you in REM sleep, that rapid eye movement time of sleep, which, as I talked earlier at the beginning about the importance of sleep. What we know is that REM is when our brain is actually actively cleaning out all the toxins that build up in our brain and the plaques and tangles that are associated with Alzheimer's. It's during that REM cycle that literally it's like it's flushing out those toxins. But the key insight from a recent study was our REM sleep is around about every 90 minutes we go into a REM cycle, and they're usually pretty short. Like, and then the first one is maybe 3 or 4 minutes, a lot of variability, but generally it's pretty short. And then every 90 minutes or so, it gets a little bit longer. So generally, the last or the end REM cycles around the 7th or 8th hour of sleep are the longest. And so that's the most reparative and restorative part of our sleep. So if we're only getting 4 or 5 hours of sleep, we just aren't even giving our brain the ability to really recover and show up the next day at its best.
Yeah. Awesome. And okay, one more thing that came to mind is like I remembered from one of, I guess, social psychology classes, the broaden and build theory, right? That talks about how positive states of mind really enhance our ability to tap into our creativity.
Mm.
And so speaking of wonder, just connecting the dots, right? So if you want more innovation, you want more creativity, you want more teamwork in your company, having employees and being in that state of mind of wonder, which is an amazing positive state of mind, is definitely going to create more opportunities for things like innovation, creativity, teamwork, helpful behaviors, and contribution, and things like that. So I can definitely see how it is all related.
Yeah, yeah. And not to get too neuroscience nerdy, but what the studies show, and I'll have to look up that one, I bet it correlates, is we have kind of two main networks in our brain. There's a default mode network, which is kind of how it sounds, default, where our brain goes to just on autopilot. And generally, when we're left to our own devices, people, when they let their mind kind of wander, unfortunately, tend to go to kind of a negative place, tend to go to what they're worried about, or, why, something that is an upset from the way past. And so mind wandering can really impact our happiness and our well-being. And the other main network is called the central executive network. And that's the one where we're doing our best thinking, reasoning, and judgment, decision-making, problem solving. And it's an either or, right? Either our thinking brain is really activated, that frontal lobe, or we're stuck in more that ruminative sort of worrying state of thinking. And so I think that it absolutely is the more we can stay on the positive side, quiet that default mode network, which is really what the all studies showed, was that when we can slow down or quiet that default mode network, we just have more accessibility to the parts of our brain to be more active that are more creative and innovative. But it really does take quieting that monkey mind piece first to retrain the brain to not go to worry or anxiety, but to go to a more productive and forward-looking state.
Mm-hmm. Yes, awesome. Thank you, Dee. There's so many amazing actionable strategies from that we can gather from you, so I appreciate it. If you were to give like one last piece of advice to the audience to get their brain fitness in check or start on their journey, what would it be?
Gosh, to sum it into one thing, I think the message, the idea that anxiety or depression, are kind of not your fault, that it is just the way our brain is wired, but we do have the power to flip that switch. But it does just take practice and time and patience with ourselves. I'll often tell people, practice kind of radical self-care. The idea of putting on your own oxygen mask on a plane before you help anybody else, because we really need to take care of ourselves. And that it's probably harder in today's world, but to make that a priority, just like we make time to go to the gym, make the time to meditate, sit quietly. And I'm happy to offer a lot more resources, and the Wired for Wonder ebook has a lot more ideas in there too.
Perfect. Thank you so much. If people want to find you, work with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, my tagline is NeuroFit Now. So that's the website, neurofitnow.com. And that's also my Twitter handle as well. So I'd love to connect on LinkedIn or Twitter and stay in touch. It's been a pleasure, Maria.
Yes, thank you, Dee. Thank you for your contribution. I had a lot of fun. I mean, I wish we could have this conversation for a few more hours and really dig into the neuroscience because it's fascinating.
You will have to do Summit 2.0 because there's probably going to be a lot more to follow up with.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you, Dee. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you later.